Voila! We're going to talk about interest groups. Remember pluralism, elitism, and hyperpluralism from Theories of Democracy? If not, we're about to revisit it. So your first flipped assignment is to analyze this quote from Barry Goldwater on interest groups. Do you think it's true, and what theory of democracy is it describing? If you don't remember what these theories are, hold on to your pants. They're going to come up in the next few slides, so feel free to come back to this assignment. So what is an interest group? Well, we've gone over this in class. It's an organization of people with shared policy goals, entering the policy process at several points to try to achieve those goals. So interest groups are non-political groups that work through politics. And by non-political, I mean they're not like necessarily party affiliated, but they do work with politicians. So what's the difference between the two, interest groups and parties? Interest groups support candidates, whereas political parties nominate them. Interest groups have very narrow and specific focuses, and parties tend to be more big tent and focus on an electorate with a wide range of opinions and views. Interest groups compete for influence over elected officials so that they make public policy decisions in the group's favor. Political parties compete for control of the branches of government, trying to win the majority of seats, usually in Congress and the presidency. So these are the theories of democracy. To relate back to that Barry Goldwater quote for your first flipped assignment, the pluralist theory is the idea that politics is a competition between groups, each one pressing for its own preferred policies. The elitist theory is that societies are divided along social class lines, and that there's an upper class of elites who kind of control things regardless of what formal niceties we happen to have in our government organization. And the hyperpluralist theory is this idea that groups are so strong that the government is weakened. It's basically an extremist or exaggerated form of the pluralist theory. Groups can overtake the government. So, like, for example, the NRA arguably has more power than parties. At least it gets more done than parties. Alright, so theories of politics and interest groups. There's the pluralism and group theory, which says that groups provide a key link between the people and the government. Groups compete, which makes it so that no one group will become too dominant. That's something that was argued at least by Madison in Federalist 51, the importance of factions, which would include political parties and interest groups. They compete, so they keep each other in check. And groups play by the quote-unquote rules of the game, so everyone is playing kind of on a fair field, and everyone's playing by the same rules. Groups weak in one resource may use other resources, so they're not. So this is like going on the theory that groups are relatively equal and can keep each other in check. Then there's the elitist view of interest groups, which is that the real power is held by really just a few interest groups. Most interest groups don't have that much power at all. Largest corporations, like ExxonMobil, have the most power. Other groups may win minor policy battles, but elites usually prevail when it comes to big policy decisions. And then the last theory of democracy as it relates to interest groups is hyperpluralism, and how it interacts with interest groups and liberalism. So this idea is that there are sub-governments that consist of a network of smaller groups that exercise a lot of control over specific policy areas. This is also known as iron triangles, which we talked a little bit in class. They consist of interest groups, government agencies, and congressional committees that handle particular policies. And those three groups work together to get policies passed. And they work together for probably usually like personal gain and also policy gain. The hyperpluralist critique is that groups have become too powerful as the government tries to appease every single interest. So there's a lot of these sub-governments that aggravate the process. Trying to please every single group results in contradictory policies, right? You can't necessarily support environmentalist groups while scratching the back of ExxonMobil at the same time. So what makes an interest group successful? Size. Size does matter. Smaller groups are more organized and more focused on group goals. there is the free rider problem, which is the problem when people don't necessarily want to join the interest groups, but they want the benefits of what the group is doing. This is more of a problem that you see with bigger groups. And larger groups are also difficult to organize. So an example of an interest group that deals a lot with the free rider problem is the AARP. You can join the AARP, it's a small fee. And then there are benefits that you get as a member, but the AARP largely works on policies that benefit not just AARP members, but all elderly people. So they have, because they are so large, they do have that free rider problem where everyone that benefits from the group isn't necessarily financially helping to support the group. Olson's law of large groups states that the larger the group, the further it will fall short of providing the optimal amount for the collective good of the people supporting it. So the idea is that to overcome Olson's law, you would provide selective benefits, because then that would decrease the size of your group. Goods that a group can restrict, so they can pay their annual, so that people that join the group can afford to pay annual dues. Another thing that makes interest groups successful is intensity. Interest groups that focus on single issues have very narrow interest. They dislike compromise. They often draw membership from people with new politics or very single-minded politics. These groups may focus on an emotional issue, providing them with a psychological advantage. This intensity encourages non-conventional means of participation. A good example of a single-issue group would be the NRA. Their thing is ensuring that gun regulation is not passed. And there's not really any room for compromise, even if, as has been shown, lots of Americans support some quote-unquote common-sense gun regulations. Because the NRA is so powerful and so driven by this single issue of just prohibiting all gun regulation, really nothing gets passed. And people that are members of the NRA are very emotional about this. They often, when they're interviewed or they talk on the news, say, this is a matter of national security. It's a matter of keeping my family safe. And what is more emotional than that? And those are the things that the NRA plays to. Another thing that helps interest groups is financial resources. Not all groups have equal amounts of money. Obviously, corporations have more, larger interest groups have more. Monetary donations usually translate into access to politicians, like phone calls, meetings, support for policies. Wealthier groups have more resources and presumably, therefore, more access. But they don't always win on policy. Having said that, most of the time they do. There are a few types of interest groups. As far as economic interest groups go, there are labor interest groups, agriculture interest groups, and business interest groups. Here are some examples of that. Then there are environmental interest groups, equality-based interest groups, and consumer public interest lobbies. So good examples of economic interest groups here would be the American Federation of Labor, environmental interests, things like the Sierra Club. Equality would be the NAACP or the NOW, or AARP. Consumer and public interest lobbies, things like the NRA, the AMA, PETA. So there's actually going to be a few flipped assignments in this PowerPoint. Most of them are going to be multiple choice questions like this, so feel free to pause here, answer this question, just paraphrase the question and paraphrase the answer like we do for bell ringers. All right, so how do groups shape policy? The main way that interest groups shape policy is through lobbying. This is a quote from Lester Milbreath: "Communication by some other than a citizen acting on his own behalf, directed to a government decision maker with the hope of influencing his decision. That's what lobbyists do." The term lobbyist actually comes from a hotel in Washington, D.C., where people used to meet with politicians in the lobby over drinks to discuss groups. And this is before interest groups became really formalized. This tradition started in the early 1800s, and so that's why lobbyists are called lobbyists, because they used to work out of lobbies with alcoholic drinks. There are two types of lobbyists: regular and temporary hires. Regular lobbyists tend to get paid a lot more, obviously. Lobbyists, again, they're technically not allowed to bribe politicians. They provide information for committee hearings. They help politicians plan political strategies for legislation. They give them arguments to use in debate. They help politicians plan political strategies for re-election campaigns. They're a source of ideas and innovations. There's mixed evidence as to whether lobbying works, but one thing is for sure, it is a booming business. All right, so your third flipped assignment is this second multiple choice question. Feel free to pause here. All right. Other ways that interest groups shape policy. There's electioneering. That's direct group involvement in the election process. Groups can help fund campaigns. They can provide testimony. They can appear in ads. They can get members to work for candidates in some form, PACs, or donate heavily to PACs. And we talked about PACs. They're political action committees. They're public funding vehicles that were created by the campaign finance reforms of the 1970s, and they're used to donate money to candidates. PACs help pay bills for campaign costs, and most PAC money goes to incumbents, something like 90%. Another way that interest groups help shape policy is through litigation, so taking it to the courts. If an interest group fails in one arena, then the courts might help them. So sometimes if a case is picked up by one of the circuit courts or the Supreme Court, interest groups can file what's called an amicus curiae brief, which means a friend to the court. And it's not an official stance from a lawyer, but it does provide points of view and formal research that maybe lawyers aren't bringing in. Class action lawsuits also permit a small number of people to sue on the behalf of other people who are similarly situated. So sometimes interest groups will help to fund and be part of class action lawsuits. The NAACP did that with like Brown versus the Board of Ed. The interest groups can also go public with issues because public opinion matters to policymakers. Groups will try to cultivate a good public image to build goodwill with the public. They'll use marketing strategies to influence public opinion. They advertise. They heavily advertise. This is your next flipped assignment. Feel free to pause here. And yeah, that's it. So there's just some multiple choice to do in this. I will see you all tomorrow.